As we go straight into scenario 1, the first scenario is the effect of punishment on faults in gymnastics when performing tricks on the beam. Now first, the first thing that's wrong with this scenario is that the coach has to consider what punishments that they're going to use, and they haven't made it clear to the participants what punishment they are going to use, which means it's going to cause added pressure and possible anxiousness, which is probably going to decrease their performance. Now this also links with health and safety, because if their performance is going to decrease, they're not going to be performing their tricks up to a high ability, and tricks on the beam is something that you need to consider as it has a high risk factor. And say if they fell off or anything, the coach would probably have to be spoken to with the leader of the gymnastics club, and they have the consequence of this is that they have the injury of the student in their, they'll have it in their history, as in they didn't look at this scenario properly, they didn't think about the possible effects that they would have, and it could lead to them being fired, or even it could risk their possible job life in future, as if someone was looking through their records, find that someone had broken their leg because they fell off a beam due to their experiment, then they wouldn't want to be hired again by another club. Another thing you have to think about is respect, and you have to have, the coach has to have respect for the students, because he doesn't think about the past two things I've spoken about, or anything in the scenario about the punishments or the health and safety. The next thing I'm going to talk about is that they haven't had any BASES accreditation, so this experiment hasn't been approved by BASES, and if any of these results were going to go anywhere, or if anyone was going to injure themselves in this then would probably be a bigger consequence, as it would lead into legal action, and they could either be they would not be able to make any other experiments, as they didn't have BASES accreditation with this one, and if anything went wrong, excuse me, then they wouldn't be able to conduct any more experiments, and they could either be, if anything really, really bad happened, then they could even end up in prison. And the last thing wrong with this is the risk-benefit analysis, and this should probably happen first if you're looking at or second to the BASES accreditation, but you should look at this as are the risks of the experiment worth taking for the benefit of the results. Moving on to scenario 2, we're looking at a gymnast coach asks 10 students who are at a high level to take part in a high intensity limbering class for some research. Once the results are recorded, they will be posted on the online forum. Firstly, the coach has asked the students, they're not volunteers, and for an experiment to be non-biased, etc., the participants have to be volunteers, so the students don't feel like they're forced into doing anything they don't want to do. Secondly is the right to withdraw. The participants should be aware that they do have the right to withdraw in this experiment, and they're not forced to do it. Thirdly is the coach qualified, because they're taking part in a very high intensity class, and if the coach isn't qualified, then there's a possible lot of injury or harm to the students, and they're putting them at risk. Thirdly is scientific misconduct, and because these results are going to be used by other people, the researcher has to make sure that the results from the test aren't biased in any way, shape or form, and that the results correlate with the experiment itself, and that it all makes sense, because otherwise they could be they will be in trouble with the head, and the researcher will be in trouble with the coach if they're posting results of their students online and they're not correct. And lastly is the data protection or the confidentiality and anonymity of the participants, because they're being posted on an online forum, and the coach has to make sure that their names are not on there, as this is a data protection, as they're young gymnasts, and that this is being done anonymously. And the consequences for this is that if they're not used anonymously, then they again could lose their BASES accreditation, which means that they've gone against the rules and regulations, and that this experiment won't be allowed to happen, or neither of the experiments by the observer or the coach or the researcher will be able to happen again. And if the coach isn't qualified and something happens to the participant, then legal action will be required, because they haven't, neither the club or anyone has checked that the coach is qualified, and if something happens, then a parent or someone will probably be able to sue the club for not checking the qualification of the coach. And going against scientific misconduct, so if someone's biased, the organisers of the forum could find out, and again legal action could be taken because the results are not true. Moving on to scenario 3, and this is testing the effectiveness of stretching of partners. The coach uses verbal instruction and little demonstration. The coach also explains that they'll be taking part in a static stretching class where they end up teaching PNF stretching. The class lasts for an hour and the students are told that they're not allowed to leave without their parents or carers. Now firstly, the first thing wrong is that there's no parental consent included in this scenario, which means their parents haven't agreed for this to happen, which means the students are going on this alone and their parents haven't allowed them or haven't signed anything to say that they're allowed to do this. Secondly, again, you have to check the coach is qualified, as I talked in the last video. And another thing is deception. Now this means that the coach has clearly stated that they're going to be doing a static stretching class, but instead they have done PNF stretching. So these are very different things because PNF is a lot more complicated to do for young students than static stretching, and especially because the coach is using much more verbal instead of demonstration. PNF needs demonstration to have a full understanding. This leads to the cause of injury, this leads to the cause of misunderstanding or hurting themselves and other students. So that coach is putting every student in that class at risk. And an hour is a long time to be doing PNF stretching, and this is putting a lot of strain on the muscles. So this also affects the health and safety because these students are at a lot of big risk of injury in this class. And lastly is the right to withdraw, because the students have the right to withdraw, so if they do not want to do it, then they can't be forced to wait there for an hour without their parents or carers. They can sit out, or they have to be known that they're allowed. They have to be allowed to be told that they're not allowed to do this. Now, the most important consequence of this is that the coach is letting them do the PNF stretching with a lot of little demonstration, and this coach isn't being professional, which does suggest that they're not qualified and they do not know what they're doing. And again, this could lead to legal action and getting their base accreditation taken away from them because they're putting the students at risk, and the experiment shouldn't include high risk factors, but everything about the scenario is a high risk factor. So again, the worst thing that could happen is that they could be put in prison or sued, because if anything happens to the students, which it probably would do because of the risk factors are so high, then they could be fired from the club, they could be fired from their job, and obviously this would go in their records and it would put at risk their future careers in coaching or observation or researching. Now the last scenario is a coach wants to experiment with ability and age. All students have to perform a certain amount of tricks to determine the category they would be in. Once they've recorded the results, they put them on show at the gymnastics club so they can compare results. Now again, because these results are being in a gymnastics club, it isn't that much of a deal because it's only in a small select amount of people. It's the gymnastics club. It does go against the data protection policy. So for example, in the worst case scenario, you could have someone putting up these results and then an outsider coming into the club who's checking everything's okay. They look at the results, they see, they've used their names, they haven't made it anonymous, and because it's a professional research project, they could easily come to the club, say you're going against the rules and regulations of BASES, no more experiments allowed to be done here at all in this club. And because they're GB gymnasts, they're going to need to be doing experiments and tests and everything. So this is putting all the careers of the researchers at risk because they're not going with the BASES rules. Secondly is the ethical clearance, and this means that the coach has to make sure that because these gymnasts are young, that he has to consider the ethical reasons for this. Now the criteria of this research is that every student has to perform a certain amount of tricks to determine the category they would be in. And for example, with young students, you could have someone that's 6 years old and someone that's 10 years old. And of course, it's a very, very big age gap. So the tricks that a 6-year-old would be doing would be very different and at a much lower level than the trick that a 10-year-old would be doing. And if we're having them doing the same tricks, the 6-year-olds are going to have a lot more strain, have a lot more pressure on them, because they're wanting to obviously be competitive. They're brought up in a competitive area, and they're going to want to be competing at a higher level, so they're going to be trying their hardest at tricks they probably haven't even been taught to do yet. So they have to consider the ethical clearance and make sure that the students are not put at risk. The second thing is, and all research responsibility means is that they're working and doing the research safely and professionally. However, it's very clear that they're not in this situation because they're getting all of these students to perform these tricks when they're at different ages and at clearly different levels. And again, these students have the right to withdraw, but they're not told this, which is also, all of these things are going against the BASES accreditation. And of course, all of these things are affecting the health and safety and the risk of the children. And if someone came in from BASES and was watching this experiment, they would most definitely not be allowed to do it. And if this experiment took place and they didn't have the response from BASES to say they're allowed to do it, then again legal action would be required because you're going against a company that let you do these experiments and let them take place. So again, if anything was to happen to the students, they would be sued, a lot of money would probably be taken from the club, and again, something like prison would have to be considered because no one would want this researcher to go around and putting all the little kids that they're working with at risk.